Spring Hill, Tennessee, May 1863. General Earl Van Dorn is bent over paperwork at his headquarters desk when the door opens. He doesn't even look up. He knows the man standing there. Seconds later, he's dead. And the killer isn't wearing a Union uniform. No blue coat. No rifle. Just a local doctor. And a motive that had nothing to do with the war at all. By the time he died, Van Dorn had already been called a disaster and a genius, sometimes in the same month. This is the story of how a Confederate general clawed his way back from total humiliation, only to be brought down by something the enemy never could. Earl Van Dorn was born on September 17, 1820, in Claiborne County, Mississippi. He was a great-nephew of former President Andrew Jackson, and by every account, he was born ambitious. In 1842, he graduated from West Point, 52nd in his class. His low rank allegedly didn't come from poor academic performance, but from demerits such as failing to salute properly. Van Dorn fought in the Mexican-American War and spent years leading cavalry against native tribes on the Texas frontier, earning a reputation as fearless, aggressive, and more than a little reckless. He was also, even before the war started, known for something else entirely: women. Fellow officers and Southern society alike talked about Van Dorn's reputation as a womanizer. Charming, vain, and never particularly discreet about it. Van Dorn opposed secession. However, when the Civil War broke out in 1861, he was one of the highest-ranking officers to join the Confederacy. He captured the Union transport ship Star of the West at Matagorda Bay, forcing the first surrender of the Civil War, a move that drew national attention. Jefferson Davis handed him command in the Trans-Mississippi Theater, one of the war's most difficult and thankless assignments. And almost immediately, his ambition would collide with reality. In March of 1862, Van Dorn got his chance to prove himself at the Battle of Pea Ridge in Arkansas. On paper, his plan was bold, maybe too bold. He wanted to swing his army around the Union position and attack from behind, catching them completely off guard. One problem was that in this battle, he led infantry, not cavalry, which was his specialty. Another problem was logistics. Van Dorn moved his men fast, but he left the supply wagons behind to keep pace. His soldiers marched through freezing weather with almost no food, no rest, and dwindling ammunition. By the time they engaged the Union Army, they were exhausted before the fighting even started. The attack fell apart. Union forces held their ground, and Van Dorn was forced to retreat. He had lost the battle to a smaller Union force, and this resulted in the Confederacy never threatening Missouri again. The loss badly damaged Van Dorn's reputation. It was an early, painful lesson. Aggressiveness is a double-edged sword. Van Dorn's stock didn't recover quickly. He was transferred east to Mississippi, where he took part in the defense of Corinth, a critical rail junction the Confederacy couldn't afford to lose. When Corinth ultimately fell to Union forces and the Confederates could not retake the city in a subsequent battle, much of the blame landed on Van Dorn's shoulders. By late 1862, he'd gone from one of the Confederacy's most promising commanders to a man many in the Southern press and military leadership considered a liability. There were even calls for a court of inquiry into his conduct. For most officers, this kind of fall from grace would have ended a career. For Van Dorn, it was about to become the setup for one of the best stretches of his war. Stripped of infantry command, Van Dorn was given control of a cavalry division instead, and it turned out to be exactly where his aggressive, fast-moving style actually worked. It was a role in which Van Dorn was never beaten. In December 1862, he led what became known as the Holly Springs Raid. Van Dorn's cavalry swept into the Union Supply Depot at Holly Springs, Mississippi, and destroyed it almost entirely. Food, ammunition, equipment, all of it. The raid was so damaging that it forced Ulysses S. Grant to call off his first attempt at capturing Vicksburg altogether. For a few weeks, Van Dorn had single-handedly stalled one of the Union's most important campaigns in the entire war. He followed that up in March 1863 with a strong tactical win at the Battle of Thompson's Station, capturing a large number of Union prisoners. After Pea Ridge and Corinth, this was exactly the redemption story Van Dorn needed. His name was being mentioned with real respect again. And then, just weeks later, none of it would matter. While stationed in Spring Hill, Tennessee, Van Dorn's headquarters operated near the home of a local physician and state legislator, Dr. George Peters, and his much younger wife, Jessie Peters. It didn't take long for rumors to spread that Van Dorn, a man whose reputation with women had followed him for years, was having an affair with Jessie. Mrs. Peters had allegedly been bored by her husband's constant absence. Gossip quickly spread around town about Van Dorn's visits to Mrs. Peters' home and the couple's frequent unchaperoned carriage rides together. The townspeople mocked Dr. Peters for being a cuckold. Seeking proof of his wife's indiscretions, one night, he hid outside his house and allegedly saw Van Dorn and his wife in a passionate embrace. He threatened to shoot Van Dorn on the spot, but the general pleaded for mercy if he would spare Mrs. Peters from any responsibility in the incident. Dr. Peters accepted this offer. However, less than a month later, Dr. Peters visited Van Dorn's headquarters under the pretext of routine business. Nothing that would have raised suspicion. Van Dorn, seated at his desk writing, apparently didn't think twice about the visit. Peters shot him in the left side of the head and walked out. Van Dorn died 4 hours later. Peters was never convicted. He claimed Van Dorn had violated the sanctity of his home, and in the social and legal climate of the time, that defense was enough to protect him. He was never seriously punished for killing a Confederate general. Condemnation of Van Dorn in the South was widespread, as the code of honor ran strong in the region for certain behaviors. However, his funeral was marked by what eyewitnesses described as an immense procession of soldiers, suggesting great support from the military. His wife, however, was notably absent from the funeral. Later, there were stories that the killing was a convenient cover for something else, a personal grudge, Van Dorn's relationship with other members of Peters' family, or even political motives tied to Van Dorn's military authority in the area. Whether justice, jealousy, or something else entirely was actually behind the shooting is a question that was never fully settled, then or now. Here's what makes Van Dorn's death tragic when you step back and look at the whole picture. He survived Pea Ridge. He survived the fallout from Corinth and the very real possibility of a court-martial. He rebuilt his reputation with Holly Springs and Thompson Station, clawing his way back from being labeled a disaster to being one of the more effective cavalry commanders in the West. And after all of that, after multiple battlefield disasters that could have ended him professionally, and combat that could have ended him physically, Earl Van Dorn wasn't killed by the Union at all. He was killed in his own headquarters, by a man who wasn't even a soldier, over a scandal that had nothing to do with the war he'd spent 2 years fighting. It's an ending that, in a lot of ways, has overshadowed everything he actually accomplished. Ask most people about Van Dorn today, and if they know anything about him at all, it's usually how he died, not what he did. Van Dorn beat armies. He couldn't survive his own reputation. Thank you for watching. If you want more stories like this, the strange human side of Civil War history, subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.